Last Tuesday, just 3 days before the ceremony, I canceled my daughter Emily's wedding. The whole thing. The sprawling vineyard estate that cost over $40,000, the gourmet caterer, the string quartet, every last detail, gone. I picked up the phone and, with a calm I didn't know I possessed, I dismantled the fairy tale I had spent the last 30 years of my life building for her. I know what you're probably thinking. What kind of father does that? What kind of monster rips away his daughter's dream day? But before you cast your stone, you need to hear the whole story. You need to understand, this was never about the money. It was about a promise I made to my late wife Clara, and the moment I realized I wasn't a father in my daughter's eyes anymore. I was just a walking, breathing ATM with a sentimental backstory. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions about this story in the comments. The story of how we got here is one of quiet sacrifice and loud disrespect, and it all came down to a single, devastating conversation over a dinner I also paid for. My house has always been a quiet place, especially since Clara passed 5 years ago. It's a modest, 2-story home I built with my own 2 hands back in '88. The floors creak in familiar places, and the air always carries the faint, comforting scent of pine and sawdust that drifts in from my workshop in the garage. For 30 years, this was our sanctuary. Now, it's mostly just me and the ghosts of happier times. My evenings usually end in the same spot, a worn, burgundy leather armchair that sits in the corner of the living room. Its surface is a roadmap of our life together, cracked and softened from years of use, with a small, faded stain on the right armrest where Clara once spilled a glass of iced tea during a summer thunderstorm. She had laughed so hard, and I can still hear it if I close my eyes. That chair was more than just furniture. It was our anchor. It's where we planned our future, where I held Emily as a baby, and where Clara spent her final peaceful days looking out at the garden. After she was gone, my life found a new purpose, a new center of gravity, Emily's wedding. It became my singular focus. My construction business, Frank's Fine Carpentry, had always provided a steady, if not spectacular, income. I'm not a wealthy man by any measure. My hands are calloused, and my back aches most mornings. But every dollar I earned above our basic needs, every weekend I spent framing a neighbor's deck instead of fishing, went into an account I'd started for Emily's college education. She was smart and got a full scholarship, so that fund, which had grown to a respectable $87,450 over 18 years, became her wedding fund. I remember Clara's words, her voice a fragile whisper in those last weeks. "Give her the world, Frank. Give her a day so beautiful she'll remember it forever." It was a promise I intended to keep. So I sat in that armchair night after night, the wedding binder open on my lap. It was a 3-inch thick monster, filled with contracts, invoices, and fabric swatches. The numbers inside were staggering, enough to make my head spin. There was the deposit for the vineyard, a breathtaking estate called Willow Creek Manor, which came to a total of $42,500. Then there was the caterer, a high-end company that charged $220 per person for a guest list of 150, totaling $33,000. The florist wanted $7,800 for arrangements of peonies and white roses, Emily's favorites. The string quartet was $3,000 for the ceremony and cocktail hour. I paid each bill as it came, transferring the funds from the account I had so carefully nurtured. With each payment, I felt a sense of pride. I was building her dream, just as I had built our home, plank by plank, nail by nail. My workshop was my refuge during those months. The smell of freshly cut oak and the rhythmic hum of the table saw were the only things that could quiet my mind. I spent weeks crafting a beautiful cedar chest as a wedding gift for Emily. As I worked the wood, sanding its surface until it was as smooth as silk, my mind would drift back. I saw her as a little girl, no older than 7, with a gap-toothed grin and sawdust in her pigtails, trying to help me build a bookshelf. Her tiny hand would rest on mine as I guided the hammer, her face a mask of intense concentration. I remembered her high school graduation, how she hugged me so tightly on the football field that I could feel her heart beating against my chest. "I love you, Dad," she'd said, her voice muffled by my shirt. "You're the best father in the world." Those memories were the fuel that kept me going. They were why I didn't flinch when I signed the check for her custom-designed wedding dress, a staggering $9,500. They were why I agreed to rent vintage cars to transport the wedding party, adding another $100 to the bill. I'd look at the photo on the mantelpiece. A 5-year-old Emily perched on my shoulders at the state fair, her face a sticky mess of cotton candy and pure joy. In her eyes, I was a giant, a hero who could win her any stuffed animal she wanted. I was doing this for that little girl, for the woman she had become, and for the wife I missed every single day. The money didn't matter. The sacrifice was the point. It was the last great act of fatherly love I could offer her, the final brick in the beautiful life I had tried to build for her. Sitting there in Clara's chair, with the scent of pine in the air and the weight of the binder on my lap, I felt at peace. I had fulfilled my promise. The stage was set for the perfect day. I had no idea it was all about to be torn down. The first cracks appeared not as a tremor, but as a series of small, almost imperceptible hairline fractures. They began with Alex, Emily's fiancé. He was a man who seemed to have been assembled in a boardroom. Impeccably tailored suits, a watch that cost more than my first car, and hands that were unnervingly smooth, as if they'd never lifted anything heavier than a leather-bound portfolio. The first time he came to my house for dinner, he walked through the door and his eyes did a quick, dismissive scan of the living room. He didn't say anything negative, but his silence was louder than any criticism. He ran a hand over the oak mantle I had carved myself and gave a tight, polite smile. "Charming," he said, the word hanging in the air like a polite insult. I tried to ignore the feeling, blaming it on my own blue-collar insecurities. But the feeling returned a week later when they came over to finalize the guest list. They sat on the sofa, a sea of spreadsheets and lists spread across the coffee table. I was in my armchair, Clara's chair, watching them. Alex pointed a sleek silver pen at a name on his list. "We need to add the Hendersons," he said, not looking at me. "My father's business partners." "It's a courtesy." I cleared my throat. "Emily, honey, we're already at 150 guests. The caterer charges $220 per head. That's another," I did the math in my head, $880 for 4 more people. Emily didn't even look up from her laptop. "It's fine, Dad. Just add them. It's important for Alex's career." There was no, "Please, no, do you mind?" It was a directive. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I was no longer a partner in this planning. I was an administrator, a facilitator of funds. The conversation that night kept drifting into territory that made me feel like a foreigner in my own life. They talked about their honeymoon, a 3-week tour of Italy, with stops at 5-star hotels I could only dream of. They discussed buying a condo in the city, casually mentioning figures that made my life savings seem like pocket change. At one point, Alex leaned back, stretching his arms. "You know, Frank," he said, his tone casual, "we'll have to do something about this place after the wedding." He gestured vaguely around my home. "The property value in this neighborhood is skyrocketing. A good developer could put up 3 townhouses here. It's a gold mine." I just stared at him, my hand gripping the arm of my chair. He was talking about bulldozing the house I built, the walls that held every memory of my wife, the floorboards where my daughter took her first steps. Emily just nodded, typing something on her phone. "We can talk about that later, Alex." She didn't defend the house. She didn't defend me. She just postponed the verdict. The deepest cut, however, came a few weeks before the ceremony. I had just finished the cedar chest I was making for her. It was beautiful, if I do say so myself. The grain of the wood was like flowing water, and I'd lined the inside with soft, aromatic cedar that filled the workshop with a clean, sweet scent. I called Emily, my voice full of pride, and asked her to come see it. She arrived an hour late, phone pressed to her ear, deep in a conversation about floral centerpieces. She walked into the workshop, gave the chest a cursory glance, and said, "Oh, that's nice, Dad," before turning her attention back to her call. "No, hydrangeas are too suburban." Nice. 30 years of woodworking skills, 100 hours of labor, a gift infused with a lifetime of love, and all it got was a nice. She never even touched it. She didn't run her hand over the smooth finish or smell the fresh-cut cedar. She saw a wooden box, not a father's heart. I stood there alone in my workshop long after she left, the scent of sawdust feeling less like comfort and more like dust from a life that was being forgotten. The silence in the room was heavy, filled with the unspoken truth that I was building her future, while she was busy erasing my past. The breaking point didn't happen in my workshop or in the familiar quiet of my home. It happened in a place I didn't belong, over a meal that cost more than my weekly groceries. Emily had insisted we have a final planning dinner at a restaurant downtown called The Gilded Sparrow. The name alone felt pretentious. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of lemon and money. The tablecloths were so white they hurt my eyes, and the silverware was heavy, a collection of forks and spoons whose purpose I couldn't guess. I felt my calloused hands were a stain on the pristine linen napkin in my lap. Alex, of course, looked perfectly at home, swirling a glass of red wine that the waiter said had notes of cigar box and black cherry. To me, it just tasted bitter. We spent the first hour going over the seating chart. Or rather, they did. I mostly listened as they debated whether Alex's cousin should be seated away from his ex-wife, and whether the Hendersons would be offended if they weren't at the head table with Alex's father. My own family, my two brothers and their wives, were relegated to a table near the back by the kitchen entrance. "It's just easier that way, Dad," Emily had explained, not looking at me. "They'll have more fun with people they know." I didn't say anything. I just watched them draw circles and arrows on a diagram of the reception hall, two generals planning a campaign where I was just a civilian bystander. I sipped my water, the ice cubes clinking against the glass, the sound unnaturally loud in my ears. Then, after the waiter cleared our appetizer plates, Emily set her fork down with a delicate click. She took a deep breath, placing her perfectly manicured hands on the table, a gesture so rehearsed it felt staged. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She stared at a point just over my left shoulder. "Dad?" she began, her voice a little too bright, a little too smooth. "Alex and I were talking, and we've made a small change to the ceremony procession." I waited, my stomach tightening. This was it. The other shoe I hadn't even realized was hanging over my head. "We feel well. We think it would be more fitting if Richard walked me down the aisle." The words hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. For a second, I was sure I had misheard. The low hum of the restaurant faded into a dull roar in my ears. My own father walking my daughter down the aisle. But my father passed away a decade ago. Then it hit me, Richard. Alex's father. A man I had met twice, a real estate mogul with a corner office and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hand, which was reaching for my water glass, froze in midair. Alex, seeing my stunned silence, smoothly stepped in, placing a condescendingly gentle hand on Emily's arm. "It's a matter of optics, Frank," he said, his voice dripping with practiced reason. "Richard is a significant figure in our community. His presence is symbolic. It's about presenting a strong, unified front for our family's future." A unified front. My mind snagged on the phrase, a front where I was not included. I was the foundation, buried underground and out of sight, while Richard got to be the grand entrance. I looked at Emily, pleading with my eyes for her to say something, to say this was a joke, a misunderstanding. But she just picked at a loose thread on the tablecloth, her silence a confession. She was choosing the symbol of a wealthy stranger over the man who taught her to ride a bike, who held her when she had nightmares, who had worked until his bones ached to give her this very day. In that moment, something inside me didn't break. It froze. It turned from a raw, aching grief into something cold, hard, and perfectly clear. The image of Clara, frail in her bed, flashed in my mind. "You'll walk our baby down the aisle," she'd whispered. It was a promise. The last one I made to her. I slowly lowered my hand to the table. I looked at both of them, my gaze steady. The hurt was still there, a hot coal in my chest, but it was now banked by a strange, chilling calm. They expected me to argue, to plead, to get angry. I would do none of those things. I simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I see," I said. My voice was even, devoid of any emotion. The word hung between us, heavier than anything else said that night. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of awkward silence. They tried to fill it with chatter about the honeymoon, but their words were just noise. When the bill came, a shocking $472.50, I placed my credit card on the tray without a word. It was the last expense I would ever cover for them. As I walked out of the restaurant and into the cold night air, the decision was already made. They wanted Richard to play the part of the father. Fine. Then he could pay for the production. The long drive home was a silent movie played out against the city's indifferent lights. Each traffic signal that turned from red to green felt like a small, mocking push forward into a future I no longer recognized. The low hum of the engine was the only sound, a monotonous drone that did nothing to fill the cavernous silence in my chest. My mind kept replaying Emily's words, her gaze fixed on the wall behind me, her voice so polished and detached. She wasn't just replacing me in a ceremony. She was editing me out of the story, erasing the 30 years of scraped knees, bedtime stories, and sawdust-covered hugs that led to this moment. I thought of Clara, of the promise I'd whispered to her in a sterile hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and fading hope. I'll walk our baby down the aisle. It wasn't just a promise. It was the final chapter of our life together, and my daughter had just handed the pen to a stranger. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house looked darker than usual. Inside, the familiar scent of pine felt thin, almost hollow. I didn't turn on the television or pour myself a drink. I just walked over to the burgundy armchair, Clara's chair, and sank into it. Its worn leather felt like the only honest thing left in the world. I sat there in the dark for hours, the wedding binder on the coffee table looking like a monument to my own foolishness. Each invoice I had paid, each vendor I had spoken to, felt like a brick I had laid for a house I was now being evicted from. They weren't just taking my place in the aisle. They were taking my home, my history, my very identity as a father. They didn't see me anymore. They saw a function, a funding source. And they assumed, with the casual cruelty of the entitled, that the source would never run dry. Sleep never came. The next morning, as the first pale light of dawn filtered through the blinds, my phone buzzed on the end table. It was a text from Emily. My heart gave a foolish little leap, hoping for an apology, an explanation, anything. But there was no remorse. The message was cold, clinical, and utterly devastating. It was a link to a website for tuxedo rentals. The text read, "Dad, this is the one Richard is wearing. We need you to match for the photos. Please have it ordered by the end of the day." A beat. Then a second message followed. Also, the final payment for the band, $3,500, is due today. Can you handle it? That was it. I wasn't a person to be consoled. I was a task on a to-do list. An item to be coordinated, like the floral arrangements. Handle it. The grief that had been churning in my gut for hours didn't erupt. It simply cooled, hardening into something dense and unyielding. I looked at the phone, at her words on the screen, and I felt nothing but a profound, chilling clarity. They would not see this coming. That Tuesday morning, the sun streamed through the living room window, casting long shadows on the floor. It was 6:15 a.m. I hadn't slept. I just sat in Clara's chair, the phone lying face down on the end table, a dark, silent rectangle. The text messages from Emily were still there, a digital monument to my own obsolescence. Handle it. 2 words that had severed a 30-year bond. I picked up the phone, not to reply, but to use its calculator. I opened the wedding binder, my hands steady, and began to tally the numbers. The total cost was projected to be $97,900. I had already paid out $79,150 from the fund. That left a balance of $18,750 in the account. An additional $18,750 they still expected me to provide. I closed the binder, the soft thud of its cover, the first sound in a new war. My first stop wasn't a vendor. It was my bank. A quiet brick building on Main Street that still had human tellers behind glass partitions. I walked in at 9:02 a.m., the air smelling of clean paper and disinfectant. I sat down with a personal banker named Mrs. Gable, a kind woman with graying hair who had helped me set up the college fund for Emily 20 years ago. "Frank, good to see you," she said with a warm smile. "Getting close to the big day, isn't it?" I gave her a thin, polite smile in return. Something like that, I said. I need to make some changes to my accounts. 10 minutes later, I had closed the joint savings account I shared with Emily, the very account I had been funding for 2 decades. I transferred the remaining balance of $18,750.34 into a new individual account solely in my name. Then, I had her print out a complete transaction history for the last 12 months. The statement was 6 pages long, a meticulous record of every dollar I had poured into a dream that was no longer mine. It was my first piece of evidence. Back in my truck, I didn't drive home. I drove to the office of a man named David Chen, a lawyer I'd used a few years back to draft some contracts for my business. His office was on the 2nd floor of a modest building, above a bakery. The smell of baking bread followed me up the stairs. It was a comforting, grounding scent. I hadn't made an appointment, but his secretary let me in. David was a no-nonsense man, sharp and direct. I laid the binder and the bank statement on his polished desk. "I need some advice, David," I said, my voice even. "I've been financing a major event, and the terms of my involvement have changed. All of these contracts are in my name, paid from my account." He spent the next hour reading, his pen making small, precise notes in the margins. He looked at the venue agreement, the caterer's invoice, the florist's bill. He didn't ask about the event or who it was for, he just focused on the legal text. Finally, he looked up at me over his glasses. "Well, Frank," he said, "you hold all the cards. Legally, this is your event. You're the sole client. You can modify, postpone, or cancel any of it as you see fit, subject to the cancellation clauses in each contract." He tapped the vineyard agreement. "This one requires a 72-hour notice for a partial refund of the deposit. Today is Tuesday. The event is Saturday. You're outside that window. You'll lose the full $42,500. I just nodded. "I'm aware," I said. "It's not about the money." My next move was about protecting my home. Alex's casual remark about bulldozing my house for townhouses had been circling in my mind like a vulture. It wasn't just wood and nails. It was Clara's garden, the pencil marks on the doorframe measuring Emily's height, the creak of the 3rd step on the staircase. It was my life. On David's recommendation, I made an appointment for the following week with an estate planner. The goal was simple: to place my house and my business into an irrevocable trust. It would ensure that no one, not Emily, not Alex, not some greedy developer, could ever touch it. It would be my fortress, a legacy preserved not for them, but from them. This was a move for the future, a quiet act of defiance that they would only discover when it was far too late. That afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table and made my first call. I started small, testing my own resolve. I dialed the number for Classic Wheels, the company providing the vintage cars. A cheerful voice answered. "Classic Wheels, how can I help you?" I took a breath. "Hello, my name is Frank Miller. I'm calling to cancel a reservation for this Saturday, September 21st. The reservation number is CW8814. There was a pause, the sound of typing. "Okay, Mr. Miller, I have it here. A 1958 Rolls-Royce and a Bentley for the Miller-Thompson wedding. The cancellation fee is the 50% deposit, which was $1,050. Is that correct?" "That is correct," I said, my voice a flat line. "Please proceed with the cancellation and email me the confirmation." I hung up. It was done. It was surprisingly easy. There was no emotion, just a clean, simple transaction. One brick removed from the wall. Throughout the day, my phone buzzed intermittently. "Emily, Alex, Emily again." A text. "Dad, did you call the band? They said the payment is late. Call me." Another one an hour later. "Are you getting my messages? This is important." I looked at the screen, at her name, and felt a profound distance, as if I were looking at the name of a stranger. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt nothing. Just a quiet determination. I put the phone on silent and placed it in a drawer. They could leave all the messages they wanted. I was no longer on their schedule. I was on mine. I opened the binder again, turning to the next tab. The string quartet. I picked up the phone and began to dial. Each call was another stone pulled from the foundation, and I could already feel the magnificent structure they were so proud of beginning to wobble. The string quartet was next. Their agent, a woman with a crisp, professional voice, was polite but firm. The contract, which I had signed on a sunny afternoon in April, was ironclad. The full fee of $3,000 was non-refundable if canceled within 30 days of the event. I had paid it in full back in July. I understand, I told her. Thank you for your time. No argument, no haggling. It was a sunk cost, a $3,000 lesson in misplaced devotion. I drew a neat line through the entry in my binder. Then, I dialed the photographer, a young, artistic man named Julian, whose portfolio was filled with sun-drenched photos of impossibly happy couples. He was more understanding. His contract stipulated that the 25% deposit of $2,000 was non-refundable, but the final balance of $6,000, due on the day of the wedding, was now waived. I'm sorry to hear things didn't work out, Mr. Miller, he said, his voice genuinely sympathetic. Thank you, Julian, I replied, and for a moment I felt a pang of regret for the beautiful photos he would never take. But the feeling passed. He was documenting a fantasy, and the fantasy was over. 2 more vendors down. The pile of cancellation confirmation emails in my inbox was growing. Next on the list was the florist. I hesitated for a moment, my thumb hovering over the number. Flowers were Clara's passion. Our small garden was still full of the perennials she had planted: peonies, lavender, and a stubborn climbing rose that bloomed every June, its pale pink petals a soft echo of her presence. Emily had wanted a wall of white roses and orchids, a display that cost $7.800. Clara would have found it beautiful, but wasteful. She preferred a single, perfect rose from her own garden. I remembered her telling me once, her hands covered in soil, "Flowers aren't about impressing people, Frank. They're about watching something grow." I took a deep breath and made the call. A woman named Beatrice answered. I explained the situation calmly and concisely. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Oh my," she finally said, her voice soft. "The orchids have already been shipped from Hawaii. And the roses, we have 500 stems arriving tomorrow." I felt a flicker of guilt, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of Emily's dismissive glance at the cedar chest. "I'm very sorry for the inconvenience," I said, my voice steady, "but I must cancel. I understand I will forfeit the $2.500 deposit." She sighed. "Yes, of course, I'll email you the confirmation." Another line, drawn through another entry. The beautiful wall of flowers would never be built. My phone, which had been silent for over an hour, suddenly buzzed to life on the table, vibrating aggressively against the wood. It wasn't Emily. The screen read, "Alex." I stared at it for a moment. Then, on an impulse I didn't fully understand, I answered. I didn't say anything, just held the phone to my ear. "Frank," he said, his voice tight with irritation, no greeting, no preamble. "What is going on? Emily is in a panic. The band just called her directly and said their booking was canceled. They said you called them. What are you playing at?" I remained silent, letting him fill the space. The sound of my own steady breathing was the only reply. "Look," he continued, his voice taking on that condescendingly reasonable tone he used at the restaurant. "If this is about the procession, you're being incredibly childish. This wedding is bigger than your feelings. There are important guests coming, my father's business associates. We can't have these kinds of last-minute logistical hiccups. Logistical hiccups. That's what I was. That's what my 30 years of fatherhood had been reduced to. A problem to be managed. A line item on a budget that was misbehaving. The cold clarity I'd felt that morning sharpened to a razor's edge. "Everything is being taken care of, Alex," I said, my voice so calm it sounded like a stranger's. "What does that even mean?" He snapped, his patience clearly gone. "Did you pay them, or not?" "Emily is getting calls from vendors. The rental car company just sent her a cancellation notice." "Are you trying to sabotage your own daughter's wedding a few days before it happens?" The accusation was so absurd, so completely devoid of self-awareness that I almost laughed. I was not sabotaging her wedding, I was canceling mine. "As I said," I repeated, my voice dropping to a near whisper, "everything is being handled. You'll have all the information you need by tomorrow." And before he could reply, I ended the call. I placed the phone back in the drawer, my hand not even trembling. He had given me the final confirmation I needed. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was who they were. With renewed resolve, I turned my attention to the two biggest items on the list. First, the caterer. This was a $33,000 contract for a 5-course meal, a champagne tower, and a late-night taco bar that Alex had insisted upon. My call was routed to a manager named Mr. Dubois, a man with a clipped, impatient accent who made it clear he was very busy. When I stated my intention to cancel, the line went silent. "Monsieur Miller," he said, his voice now dangerously smooth, "that is not possible. We have already purchased over $15,000 in perishable goods. Our staff is scheduled. Our contract is binding." I had anticipated this. David Chen, my lawyer, had prepared me. "Mr. Dubois," I said calmly, "if you consult Clause 11, Section B of the contract I signed, it states that cancellation within 72 hours results in the forfeiture of the 30% deposit. The deposit of $9,900 was paid on May 12th. I am not liable for any further charges." There was a rustling of papers on his end. I could practically hear him scanning the document, his arrogance turning to disbelief. "This is highly irregular," he sputtered. "I will have to speak with our legal department." "You do that," I said. "Please send the cancellation confirmation to my email address on file." I hung up before he could object further. Another $23, $100 that would not be spent on people who saw me as an inconvenience. Finally, there was only one call left to make. The big one. The one that made this whole thing irreversible. Willow Creek Manor. The $42,500 venue that was the centerpiece of their grand vision. I looked at the glossy brochure on my table, the photo of a smiling couple standing on a manicured lawn, a sprawling vineyard behind them. It looked like a place from another world, a world I had paid for but was not welcome in. I picked up the phone. The events manager, a woman named Cynthia, answered with practiced cheerfulness. My heart was pounding now, a slow, heavy drumbeat in my chest. This was the final nail. "Hello, Cynthia. This is Frank Miller," I began. "I'm calling about the Miller-Thompson wedding, scheduled for this Saturday." I explained for the last time that I was canceling the event. The cheerful voice vanished. "Mr. Miller, I don't understand. We're 3 days away. Everything is ready. The tents are being set up as we speak." I knew what the contract said. I knew there would be no refund. "I am fully aware of the terms, Cynthia," I said. "I am forfeiting the entire amount paid. Please cancel the booking." The silence that followed was profound. I had just set fire to a sum of money that had taken me years to save. But as I said the words, I didn't feel loss. I felt a strange, quiet lightness. I was buying back something far more valuable than money. I was buying back my own self-respect. The final call to the vineyard left a profound silence in its wake. I hung up the phone, and the quiet of the house settled around me, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It wasn't the lonely, echoing silence of grief. It was the calm, clean silence of a slate wiped clean. I walked into my workshop, the scent of pine and cedar welcoming me like an old friend. I ran my hand over the lid of the cedar chest I had built for Emily. It was smooth and perfect, a testament to a love that had not been returned in kind. For the first time in days, I didn't feel a pang of sadness looking at it. I felt a sense of ownership. It was mine again. The work, the love, the memories, they all belonged to me now. I hadn't destroyed a wedding. I had simply reclaimed my investment in a future that no longer included me. The piece lasted for exactly 47 minutes. It was shattered by the sound of a car tearing down my quiet street and screeching to a halt in my driveway. Headlights sliced through the evening gloom, casting long, frantic shadows across my workshop wall. A car door slammed with a force that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. Then another. Heavy, furious footsteps pounded up my walkway. There was no polite knock, just a frantic, insistent banging on the front door, the sound of fists against solid oak. I took a deep breath, wiped my hands on a rag, and walked slowly from the workshop, through the kitchen, and into the front hall. I didn't rush. This was my house. They were on my time now. When I opened the door, they were standing there, illuminated by the porch light like actors in a badly staged drama. Alex's face was a mask of crimson fury, his expensive suit rumpled, his tie askew. Emily stood beside him, her face pale and streaked with mascara, her phone clutched in her hand like a weapon. She looked from me to Alex, her eyes wide with a mixture of panic and disbelief. "What have you done?" Alex bit out the words, stepping forward so he was almost inside my house. He jabbed a finger toward me. "Cynthia from Willow Creek just called Emily, in tears. She said you canceled. You canceled everything. The caterer, the florist, everything." I didn't answer. I just looked at him, then my gaze shifted to my daughter. She was the one I wanted to hear from. "Dad," she finally whispered, her voice trembling. "Why would you do this? This is my wedding, my dream." Her words were meant to be a dagger to my heart, but the wound they were aimed at had already scarred over. "No, Emily," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "It was my dream, too, the one I promised your mother. And it was my money, all of it." Alex let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Money? This is what this is about? You're throwing a tantrum over money? After everything we've done to include you?" The sheer audacity of that statement was breathtaking. They had demoted me from father to guest, from honored host to walking wallet, and now he was accusing me of being ungrateful. "You wanted Richard to walk you down the aisle," I continued, speaking only to Emily, ignoring Alex completely. "You wanted to present a unified front with his family. That was your choice. I'm just respecting it. I've simply removed myself and my financial contributions from an event I am no longer a central part of. It seems only fair that the man who gets the honor of giving away the bride should also have the honor of paying for the wedding." Emily started to sob then, a theatrical, gulping sound that held no real sorrow, only frustration. "But he can't," she wailed. "We can't get the vineyard back on 3 days' notice. We can't find a caterer. You've ruined it. You've ruined my life." "Your life isn't ruined, Emily," I said, my voice still level. "Your party is, there's a difference." That's when Alex lost the last of his composure. He took another step forward, his face inches from mine. "You think you're clever, don't you, old man?" he sneered, his voice low and venomous. "You're going to regret this. I'll call Richard right now. His lawyers will have this house and your sad little business tied up in knots before you can even pick up a hammer. We'll take everything." He was trying to frighten me, to bully me back into submission. He still thought he held all the power. He had no idea the game was already over. I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. "You can't," I said simply. The two words landed in the space between us with the weight of solid stone. "I met with my attorney this morning. The house, the business, everything is being placed into an irrevocable trust. It's protected, it's untouchable, especially by you." The fury on Alex's face dissolved, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. He looked at Emily, who just stared back, her manufactured tears drying on her cheeks. They had no move left to make. They had come to my home to threaten and intimidate me, assuming I was just a simple-minded carpenter they could push around. They had miscalculated. They had mistaken my quiet dignity for weakness. I stepped back from the doorway, making the space my own again. "I think you should both leave now," I said. It wasn't a request. It was a dismissal. For a long moment, they just stood there, frozen on my porch, the architects of a fallen empire. Then, without another word, they turned and walked back to their expensive car, their furious footsteps now sounding like a pathetic retreat. I closed the door, the solid click of the lock echoing through the quiet house. It was the sound of the end, and the beginning. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments what you thought. I really want to know your opinion. Here you will always find stories that move, surprise, and bring lessons to take with you for life. The final meeting was not on their terms, nor on mine. It was on neutral ground, in the sterile, beige-walled conference room of my lawyer, David Chen. The air smelled of old paper and weak coffee. A single, generic print of a sailboat hung on the wall, a placid scene that felt miles away from the storm that was about to break. I sat at one side of the long, polished mahogany table, a file folder containing copies of every invoice and every cancellation notice resting neatly in front of me. David sat beside me, his posture relaxed but attentive. We were waiting, They were, predictably, 10 minutes late, a final, petty assertion of their perceived importance. When the door opened, 3 figures filled the frame. Alex and Emily were flanked by a man I instantly knew was Richard Thompson. He was exactly as I'd imagined. Tall, with a mane of silver hair, a deep tan that spoke of golf courses and yacht clubs, and a suit so perfectly tailored it looked like a second skin. He radiated an aura of immense, unshakable confidence, the kind that comes from a lifetime of buying whatever and whoever he wanted. He strode in first, extending a hand not to me, but to my lawyer. "Richard Thompson," he said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "I assume you're the one advising Mr. Miller on this unfortunate situation." He didn't shake my hand. He didn't even look at me. To him, I was not a person in the room, but a problem on the agenda. They took their seats opposite us. Emily wouldn't meet my eyes, her gaze fixed on a small scratch on the table's surface. Alex sat stiffly, his face a blotchy mix of anger and anxiety. Richard, however, leaned forward, placing his manicured hands on the table, a king addressing his court. "Let's dispense with the pleasantries," he began, his eyes finally locking onto mine. "Frank, I understand you've had some sort of emotional episode. While regrettable, your actions have caused significant financial and reputational damage. I am here to facilitate a solution. You will call these vendors back, you will reinstate the contracts, and my office will wire you the remaining balance of $18,750 to cover the final expenses. We will consider the matter closed." He spoke with the finality of a judge passing sentence. He wasn't negotiating, he was dictating terms. I didn't say a word. I simply looked at David, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He opened his own file, which was identical to mine. "Mr. Thompson," David began, his voice calm and methodical, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Frank is not here to renegotiate. He is here to inform." David slid the first document across the table. It was the bank statement showing the $87,450 account, with my name as the sole depositor for 18 years. This was never a joint venture. This was a gift. A gift with certain emotional expectations, chief among them that the giver be treated with a modicum of respect. When that expectation was violated, Frank, as the sole client on every contract, exercised his legal right to terminate his arrangements. He then slid the stack of cancellation confirmations across the table. The pages fanned out slightly, a paper trail of my resolve. The caterer has been canceled, forfeiting a $9,900 deposit. The florist, $2,500. The photographer, $2,000. The cars, $1,050. The band and the string quartet, a combined $6,500. He paused, letting the numbers sink in. And of course the venue. The full, non-refundable payment of $42,500. In total, Frank has willingly forfeited $64,550. This was not an episode, Mr. Thompson. This was a calculated business decision, the price he paid to dissolve a partnership that was no longer viable. Richard's confident smirk faltered. He stared at the papers, his mind clearly struggling to process a reality where his money and influence had no power. Alex sputtered, "This is insane. You just threw away over $60,000? "It wasn't your money to worry about, Alex," I said, speaking for the first time. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension in the room. I looked directly at Emily, whose face was now ashen. "I earned every cent of that money. I remember a summer in '99 when I took a roofing job in July to pay for your braces. It was 105 degrees on that roof. I did it so you could have a perfect smile. That money had memories. It had value beyond the number on a check." I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Shame, maybe, or a distant memory of the father she had forgotten. But Richard wasn't finished. His face hardened. "This is sentimental nonsense," he snapped. "You've made your point, but don't think for a second you can touch our assets. We will see you in court for the emotional distress and damages you've caused." It was Alex's threat from my porch, now given voice by the man with the power to back it up. David Chen simply slid one last document across the table. It was a single page. "That will be difficult," he said plainly. "As of 8 a.m. this morning, Frank's home, His business and all his liquid assets were placed into a fully protected, irrevocable trust. They are legally shielded from any civil litigation you could possibly attempt. There is nothing for you to sue. There is nothing for you to take. That was the moment. The final, beautiful, terrible moment of surrender. Richard Thompson, the titan of industry, leaned back in his chair as if shoved, the air rushing out of him. The confidence evaporated from his face, replaced by a look of utter disbelief. He looked at me then, truly saw me for the first time, not as a blue-collar nuisance, but as an opponent who had outmaneuvered him completely. Alex just stared, his mouth slightly agape. And Emily finally broke. A single genuine tear traced the path of her ruined makeup. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please." But the word was empty. It was a plea from the bottom of a hole she had dug herself. I stood up slowly, my chair making no sound on the thick carpet. I looked at the three of them, a portrait of defeated entitlement. "A father is supposed to provide," I said, my voice steady and clear. "But he is also supposed to be respected. You mistook one for the other. This wedding is canceled, but my promise to your mother is not. I will always love you, Emily, but I will not fund your disrespect." I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them with the silence, the paperwork, and the staggering bill for their own arrogance. Walking out of that conference room felt like stepping out of a long, dark tunnel and into the sun. The drive home was a blur of quiet relief. When I pulled into my driveway, the house seemed to be waiting for me, not as a lonely shell of memories, but as a sanctuary. For the first time in 5 years, it didn't feel empty, it felt mine. The first thing I did was walk into my workshop. The cedar chest sat there, a silent testament to everything that had happened. I ran my hand over its smooth lid. It was no longer a rejected gift. It was a masterpiece of my own making, a symbol of my own worth. I decided it would stay right here, a beautiful reminder that my love and my labor have value, whether others recognize it or not. A few days later, a single text message appeared on my phone. It was from Emily. 3 words. "I am so sorry." I read them, and I believe in her own way she was. But sorrow couldn't rebuild the bridge she had so willingly burned. It couldn't erase the cold calculation in her eyes, or the sneering contempt on her fiancé Tzli's face. I didn't reply. Some things, once broken, can't be fixed with words. They can only be let go. The $64.50 I had lost was a steep price, but I realized it wasn't a loss at all. It was the best investment I'd ever made. I had purchased my peace. I had bought back my dignity. That evening, I made myself a simple dinner and sat down in the burgundy leather armchair in the living room. The evening sun cast a warm, golden light across the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For years, this chair had been a place of memory and obligation. It was where I mourned Clara, where I planned Emily's future, where I worried over invoices and contracts. It was a command center for a life that was no longer mine. But sitting there now, with the weight of the world lifted from my shoulders, it felt different. The worn leather seemed to mold to my back, not with the heaviness of the past, but with the comfort of the present. I looked around at the home I had built, at the photos on the mantelpiece, at the faint scent of pine that still hung in the air. I thought of that little girl with cotton candy on her face, and I smiled, not with sadness but with a gentle sense of closure. I had loved that girl with all my heart, and I had done my best. But my job as her provider was over. My new job was to be the caretaker of my own happiness. The armchair was no longer just Clara's chair. It had become my throne. A quiet, unassuming throne in a quiet, unassuming kingdom where the only currency that mattered was self-respect. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt truly rich. It's been a month since the day I dismantled a wedding. The silence in my house is no longer heavy with grief, but light with peace. I've come to understand a simple, hard truth. You can give someone the world, but you cannot make them value it. For 30 years, I thought my purpose was to build a life for my daughter, to lay down each plank of her future with my own 2 hands. I was wrong. My purpose is to live a life of dignity, to honor the promises I made to my wife by honoring myself first. The greatest lesson in this whole ordeal wasn't about money or revenge. It was about remembering that love is not a transaction. It's a partnership built on mutual respect. When that respect is gone, the deal is broken. My hands will still build things, bookshelves, decks, maybe even a new birdhouse for the garden. But now, I build for the joy of it, not out of obligation. My worth is not tied to a bank account or a lavish party. It's in the quiet integrity of a well-made joint, the comfort of this old armchair, and the freedom to say no. Never let anyone, not even your own blood, make you feel like your only value lies in what you can provide. Your presence is the real gift. Don't give it to those who only want the wrapping paper. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments what you thought. I really want to know your opinion. Here you will always find stories that move, surprise, and bring lessons to take with you for life.